Hi everyone, Stepan here. In today's video I'm going to analyze a game played between Fischer and Petrosian, and I'm doing a game analysis after a really long time. I think it's been almost a year since I've analyzed a game on the channel which wasn't mine and in the Road to GM series. And I've decided to include one game analysis per week. It's going to be every Saturday. Because I'm trying to get more game analysis in my own training routine. I think it's very useful for me, and without forcing myself to study and analyze, I hardly ever do that, and I focus on other things. So once a week, every Saturday, I'm going to do one game analysis. You can recommend the games you would like me to cover. Please leave them in the comments below. It can be any games, older games, newer games. It can be played yesterday. It can be between 1600 players. Doesn't matter. If I find it instructive and I think I can make a lesson out of it, then I'm going to cover it. And I'm going to be covering the games in a bit more detail, in a sense that I'm going to trying to highlight some points which I think were very instructive, and I'm going to try to go a bit more in depth than I did previously. Okay, so this game was in the candidates final of 1971. As you may know, before this match against Petrosian, Bobby Fischer had a streak of 19 games in which he had won. And in round one of their match, Fischer-Petrosian, Fischer also won, so it was 20 games in a row. In round two, Fischer lost, and then the scores were tied. The next three games were draws, and then in the four remaining games of the match, Fischer crushed Petrosian 4-0, and this was round 7. Before this, to reach the candidates final, Bobby Fischer defeated Bent Larsen, his once second, 6-0, and Tigran Petrosian defeated Viktor Korchnoi 5.5, 4.5, so not such a convincing win. So Bobby Fischer was a clear favorite here, especially considering his winning streak, but after the first 5 games, the scores were tied, so people thought that Petrosian was perhaps a bit more resilient opponent, and you may know that Petrosian is considered to be, the Minister of Defense, the strongest defensive player in history. So this game, I think from a psychological standpoint, you can see that Petrosian was struggling to cope with Fischer, and we are going to look at 3 positions in which he chose to go. Well, he didn't go out of mainline theory, he just chose variations which were less common. I think he was trying to get Fischer out of his ideal preparation. So Fischer opened with pawn to e4, as always, e4 best by test. Petrosian responded with the Sicilian, and after knight f3, e6, d4, we have c takes d4, knight takes d4, and a6. This is the Khan Sicilian. And from this position on, there are 2 most common moves for black. Black can either play knight f6, which is the modern variation of the Khan Sicilian, followed by castles, queen c7, queen e2, d6. This is the most popular variation. And it's equal, white is supposed to have a slight edge. The second variation is bishop to c5. This is the Polugaevsky variation, named after Lev Polugaevsky. Of course, attacking the knight, which is now unprotected because of bishop d3. So the knight is going to go to b3. After knight b3, bishop e7, the bishop can also go to a7, queen g4, g6 was provoked, and now queen e2. This is the Polugaevsky variation, the second most popular way to play. And the first psychological point of the game, where I think Petrosian showed that he was sort of rattled by Fischer, is knight c6. Knight c6 was played in the 70s and in the 60s, and it's of course a well-known variation, but it's just considered less than optimal for black. I think especially today, knight f6 and bishop c5 are much more common, but still, it's a playable variation, and he decided to go for a sideline. However, after knight takes c6, which is the best move here, by far the most popular and the best move is d takes c6. And the variation should go knight d2, e5, knight c4, attacking the pawn, knight f6. The pawn cannot be taken because of queen a5 check. So if knight takes e5, queen a5 check wins the knight, so white castles. And now he is threatening the pawn, and the variation continues. So this is the main line after knight c6, knight takes c6, and d takes c6. And Tigran Petrosian chose to take with the b pawn, which is very uncommon. Of course, it was played back then, but once again, far less common than d takes. After b takes c6, Fischer showed that he was more than prepared for this variation as well. He played the main line, he played the best moves, and now we are going to get out of the opening. Castles, d5, this is one main reason for b takes, that you reinforce the d5 break. c4, which is the main move, attacking black's strong center. Knight f6 is the main move. From now on, Petrosian played the mainline theory. C takes d5, c takes d5, e takes d5, and now one more point at which Petrosian deviated. The best move by far is knight takes d5, and the most common move. So after knight takes d5, bishop e4 should be played, pinning the knight to the rook. But black has a comfortable way to get out of this mess, bishop d6. Of course, now taking the knight would be a mistake, so bishop takes, pawn takes. If you take the pawn with the queen, then bishop takes h2, check, wins the queen. So you cannot really win a pawn. Bishop d6 is not a mistake. White should continue with knight c3, and now black has time to take the knight because he has a tempo on the queen. So knight takes c3, white cannot take the rook obviously because he loses the queen, so b takes c3 and rook b8. This is the main line, and in this position black is supposed to be equal. You can see that both sides have structural problems, so white has a weakness on c3, and on a2 black has a weakness on a6, so you could argue that black might have a slightly better pawn structure. White, in compensation for that, gets the passed pawn on the c file, which can be deadly, but with the bishop pair it's going to be easy to stop it. So when after c takes d5, e takes d5, Petrosian decided to take with the e pawn, I think this must have been a surprise both to Fischer and to everybody else, because it has been played, but it's definitely a worse move than knight takes. So now we have an isolated queen's pawn position in which Fischer's strength is emphasized because he really has a tremendous understanding for middle games, and I think his understanding in chess is the biggest in the history of the game. Nobody could match him there. So he understood what this position is about. Positions with an isolated queen's pawn are only equal or better for the side with the isolated pawn if they can prove it with dynamic play. So if you have an isolated pawn, obviously it's going to be a weakness in the endgame. It's going to be easily rounded up or blockaded or won even. But until the pieces get traded off, it could be a strength. Here you can see that the isolated d5 pawn is controlling the e4 square, creating an outpost for black. It's also controlling c5. So white's light squared bishop is definitely reduced in scope, especially in this position where it doesn't have c4, nor b5, nor e4, nor f5. So the light squared bishop is definitely a bad piece because of the pawn. So black is going to have to play dynamically to justify this. And Fischer understood this, and his approach to this game is why I chose it. This is in my top 5 Fischer games, and Fischer is my favorite player. And this game is not, it doesn't feature sacrifices, it doesn't feature any winning of material, which is major. It's just a marvelous positional game in which Fischer understood the position so well that Petrosian didn't have a chance. So the greatest defender in history of chess had to resign in about 20 moves, and we are going to see why. After e takes d5, Fischer began. Knight c3, developing his piece, putting pressure on the pawn. d4 would be very risky because the pawn would become a bigger target than before. So Petrosian continued correctly with bishop to e7. Another move that Fischer could have played instead of knight c3 is simply rook e1 check, bishop e7, and then bishop e3. But we got all of those moves in anyway. So after e d5, knight c3, bishop e7, developing, preparing to castle. And now instead of rook to e1, I think this is the first point at which Fischer showed his brilliance. The next move is extremely counterintuitive for most people, but it's, and not even according to the engines don't see it as the best move, but I think it's incredibly smart. Queen a4 check. And now you might wonder why give black a chance to develop a bishop with tempo. So bishop d7 actually wasn't played in the game, and now we are going to see why. After bishop d7, Fischer's idea was queen d4. After queen d4, your pawn is under pressure, and you really don't have time to defend it. The engines give the best line with castles for black. If you try to defend with bishop e6 or bishop c6, then you have just justified queen a4 check, and white stands better. So after castles, white can either continue with bishop f4, which is the best move, and bishop f4 simply develops another piece, puts more pressure on black's position, and continues to overwhelm the entire board. But if you want to be greedy, after the move castles, you can also take on d5. And after knight takes d5, knight takes d5, queen takes d5, there really isn't an easy way for black to punish this. And bishop b5 should be the best move. After that, simply queen d8, rook d8, bishop b5, a b5, and a3, so that after bishop f6, you can play rook b1. And white is a clear pawn up. Whether it's winning or not, I think Petrosian could defend this position. So perhaps it wouldn't have been winning, but maybe Fischer could have won. In any case, it's a clear pawn up with a fairly simple idea of queen a4 check. And after bishop to e7, queen a4 check, Petrosian of course saw that bishop to d7 would lead to queen d4 and to the inevitable either superior activity of the white pieces or to the loss of the d5 pawn. So instead of that, Tigran Petrosian continued with the move queen d7, which I think is a great practical decision. And now, of course, Fischer isn't going to take the queen and allow black to develop his bishop with tempo. Instead of that, Fischer continues with the best move in the position, rook to e1. After rook to e1, Petrosian now exchanges of the queens, queen a4, knight a4, and this was the brilliant point of Fischer's play. And this is what I would like to highlight, because most people don't really recognize this game as one of Fischer's best, but I think that everything played thus far was part of Fischer's plan. So from bishop e7 and queen a4 check, this was all part of the same plan. In the game, Tigran Petrosian continued with the move bishop e6. After bishop e6, Fischer played bishop e3, which is a normal developing move. It's much better than f4 because the knight, which is kind of awkward on a4, now actually does support the c5 square. And after Petrosian castled, I think this is the best move of the game. It's not spectacular, it doesn't sacrifice anything, but it's so strong that Petrosian really couldn't do much about it. And Fischer is just playing the position. This seems so simple. This seems unbelievably simple, as if chess was a game that anybody could learn in a day when you look at this game. So Fischer simply played the move bishop c5. What does bishop c5 do? Well, Fischer recognized that his knight on a4, once it gets to a4, which he saw was inevitable after queen a4 check, because he knew that Petrosian couldn't play bishop d7, then he saw that he was going to play queen d7, then he saw that he was going to play rook e1, and that Petrosian is going to have to exchange on a4. He saw that his knight is going to be on a4, and that it's going to be great if it manages to get to c5. Now, what options does black have to prevent the knight from coming to c5? Not a single one, really. If black doesn't take, if he defends the bishop, then Fischer is just going to take. If he takes, the knight is coming to c5 immediately. And the point is that the knight can easily be supported on c5 via b4. And this is exactly what happened. Petrosian defended, rook fe8, bishop takes e7, rook takes e7, and now b4. After b4, once the knight gets to c5, the position is going to be superior for Fischer. In this position, black can play several different things. Rook to c7 is supposed to be one of the better moves, but Petrosian continued with rook f8, and now we have knight c5. Petrosian played rook f8 to be able to defend the rook and move the bishop out of the way, so now bishop c8. And you would expect some players to exchange the rooks here, but not Fischer. This is the second point of his brilliant play in this game. He basically restrained every single option Petrosian had. If you look at the black pieces, the black rook is able to exchange itself fine. The black bishop doesn't have d7 if it doesn't want to get traded off, neither e6 or f4. It has the g4 square for now. And the knight has e4 and g4. So Fischer's next move is f3. With pawn to f3, he just kills any idea of counterplay for Petrosian. And now I believe that Petrosian knew that he was playing either for a loss or a draw. Okay, rook e to a7 was played, which is kind of a passive move, and Fischer continued with rook e5, either preparing to double, either preparing to put extra pressure on the d5 pawn, and basically infiltrating black's position. And now we can already see that all of white's pieces, apart from the a1 rook, seem optimal, while on the other hand, the bishop on c8 doesn't have any squares. The rooks on a7 and a8 seem to be defending one pawn, which is horrible. The knight on f6 is the only piece you could consider worthy, and it's probably going to have to exchange itself. So, okay, in the game, Petrosian continued with bishop to d7, trying to relieve some of the pressure from his position and trying to activate the bishop. And his idea was, and that was the point behind rook e to a7, that he wants to play bishop b5, and after bishop b5 force a trade of bishops. If Fischer takes, then recapture with the pawn and have tremendous pressure along the a file. Therefore, Fischer's easy decision, a simple strategical decision, which worked out perfectly fine, was simply knight takes d7 check. And after rook takes d7, his position now became even more superior. You might wonder, why would he exchange his great knight on c5? Well, he has better rooks and a better minor piece. If you look at this bishop, it's controlling the entire board. If you look at this knight, it doesn't have any scope. And one great thing, and why this game is so simple and perfect, is that Fischer managed to recognize every single one of his minute advantages and managed to convert them into something different, a different type of advantage, and then materialize on that in the end of the game. Rook c1 was played, simply developing his last piece. And in this position, Petrosian played rook d6, which I really hate as a move, simply because it allows rook c7, but on the other hand, what else can you suggest? If he doesn't play rook d6, well, let's see what the engine says. The engine wants to play the move d4 for some reason, but I guess the position is still almost terminal. I think he just wanted to defend his pawn and didn't know what else to do. I mean, the thing is that once Fischer plays rook c6 and the pawn moves, okay, let's say he played something stupid. Rook c6 and then the pawn moves to defend itself. Well, it can't even do that. It's now attacked twice. The rook would have to return here and then the game would be strategically losing. I mean, so rook d6 is a practical decision, but now Fischer is infiltrating the position, rook c7, and now already you can see how superior Fischer's pieces is, and this is basically game over on Grandmaster level. Petrosian must have known that he was losing the game, and what happened? Nothing happened. Queen a4 check, forcing queen d7 if he doesn't want to play bishop d7, then recapturing on a4 with the knight, which seemed weird because the knight is on the rim, then having the square c5 for the knight, by exchanging the e7 bishop and playing b4. It's as simple as that. He used one single advantage he had in the game to materialize to such a great result. So okay, now we can see that already in this position it's really hard for black to play. He played knight d7, attacking the rook, but rook e2 simply retreating. And now g6, kind of to protect h7, but not really. He wants to push through his pawns. He wants to play h5 and f5 to gain some space and to have some breathing room around his king, but that actually became a problem afterwards. And now Fischer, at this point, he has a huge advantage. All of his pieces are better than black's pieces, and now he improves his king, and this is the third part of his genius. King f2. His king was not ideally placed on g1, so why not improve it? He has time. h5, f4, stopping a further expansion. h4, king f3, f5, king e3, and now d4 check, but that doesn't matter either, king d2. Now the king is much better. After this, Petrosian continued with the move knight b6, and Fischer played rook e to e7, which is just, I mean, knight b6 is a bad move, but it's really hard to suggest a move for black. I think Petrosian was counting on knight d5 to stop rook e7. The problem is that it doesn't work tactically. If he had another move after knight b6 to play knight d5 immediately, then sure, his position might have been survivable. In fact, after knight d5, he even has the c3 square and the e3 square, and black's position might be even better. But the problem is that tactically this doesn't work because Fischer can play rook e to e7 immediately. And now after knight d5 he can simply check with the one rook and then move the other way, so knight d5 doesn't do anything. Rook f7 check, king e8 and rook b7. And this position is now already basically over. Petrosian blundered and lost in one move, unfortunately for him, but it's really hard to defend the position anyway. In the game, Petrosian took on f4, knight takes f4, and after the simple bishop c4, he just gave up. Why did he give up? Because now bishop c4 is defending both the d5 square and the e6 square, and Fischer is threatening checkmate. He's threatening checkmate with either rook g7 or rook h7, followed by rook h7 or rook g8, and there's basically nothing Petrosian can do about it. The only two moves he can do to try and prevent the checkmate are knight e6 and knight d5, which is sad, and also rook d7, which just gives up a rook. So let's say knight e6, but in that case, simply rook b to e7 or rook f to e7 would win the knight. king d8 and now wins the knight, bishop takes e6. Another option after bishop c4 would be knight d5, but then once again rook h7, threatening checkmate. He would have to play rook d7, and after rook takes rook, it's just, I mean, it's over. He doesn't even have to give the exchange. Rook check, king f8, rook check, and king can check until he wins the game. So after bishop c4, the game was basically over. After rook to b7, instead of allowing bishop to c4, double attacking the knight and threatening checkmate, the engine says that rook to b8 should be the best move, and that, I mean, I just don't understand this position. The king can then take, but I still think white is much better. Let's say he plays rook to b8. I don't think Fischer has to take, although the engine likes taking as well. King takes rook, and now this position. So this is the problem. But it's winning in any case. You can see that Fischer has a 2-to-1 pawn advantage on the queen side, which should be sufficient for a clear win for Bobby Fischer. On the other hand, Petrosian's passed pawn is easily blockaded, and Fischer can round it up easily later. So I think that at this point, after rook b7, knight f4 was a decisive blunder, but the game would have been lost anyway. But I would just like to return to this position with bishop e3. So his knight was on a4, and he knew that he had to exchange this bishop in order to take control of c5 with his knight and play b4. And this simple plan of bishop c5, which black cannot parry, and bishop takes e7, and now the move b4 was so incredibly strong that Petrosian couldn't have done anything about it. And it all started with Petrosian trying to deviate from theory. Okay, I hope you like the game. Please let me know what you think. I'm going to be doing these analysis every Saturday. If you have a recommendation for a game, and it can be any game, please paste it in the comments below. You can also message me on Patreon or on Lichess or via email, whatever you want. For those of you who are patrons, you're going to get extra material on the game, some exercises and example games similar to this one. And yeah, I hope you like the video. Let me know what you think. Stay tuned for more chess. Thank you very much for watching. Bye bye.